you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall discuss Mithras, the ancient Methulisah who ruled the Baronies of Avalon and all of its Cainites for almost 2 millennia. We shall discuss his origins, motives, and the culture surrounding him and his cult. And where do you think you are going? London. London? Absolutely not. I do not care that your mortal mother is dying, and neither should you. I told you to detach yourself from your former life. Have I not made it clear enough to you already the dangers of that place? London is not safe for kindred. Most were obliterated in 2012 by the aggressive attacks of the Second Inquisition. The former Prince Anne Bowsley is said to be gone, either in hiding or in pieces, and Lord Camden took himself and his followers off to Edinburgh, assuming the mantle of Prince in the process. You look puzzled. Why do you look puzzled? Yes, Anne Bowsley was the Prince of London before it fell, although she assumes the title of Queen rather than Prince, but that is neither here nor there. Her reign as Prince was very short-lived when compared to London's previous ruler, Mithras. He ruled the Baronies of Avalon for almost 2 millennia, which is remarkably impressive. Not even the likes of Hardestadt and Camilla were monarchs of their domains for as long with such a tight-fisted grip. Forgive my somewhat archaic tongue. The Baronies of Avalon was the title the Cainites of old would adopt for the domain ruled by Mithras, which encompassed parts of Ireland and Britain. But I can see I am just adding more confusion as I jump around from topic to topic. I forget how new you are to all of this, and the politics of Britain's kindred society is somewhat different from the US, and Europe doesn't exactly help much. So please, put down your suitcases and follow me into the study. It is about time you should learn about Mithras, for it is his strong leadership and the power of his followers that shaped kindred society in the once Great Britain, what us older vampires would refer to as the Baronies of Avalon. Although I have mentioned it to you before, I am sure you already know that the Cainite known as Mithras was of Clan Ventru. I met him twice during his arrival and then some 1200 years later, I believe? In any case, what I remember well about him is that he had a very asserting presence. He appeared to be somewhere in his mid-20s and was of medium height. He had a compact and slightly muscular build with rather tawny skin for a vampire of his age. I have to admit that he was rather handsome. Dark eyes and dark hair that he wore at shoulder length in a loose curb. When I met him, he wore a soft cloth hat of some sort, which I assume was some sort of ancient Phrygian cap. His clothing was loose also, which was probably by choice. It did not impede movement. I refer to Mithras as the Cainite known as Mithras because his name and the cult that would follow soon after his embrace mirrors that of mortal Mithraism. Mithraism or Mithraism, I've never been able to pronounce that right, so forgive me, from a mortal's perspective, is the worship of Mithra, the Iranian god of the sun, justice, contract, and war in pre-Zoroastrian Iran. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, this deity was known as Mithras, honored as the patron of loyalty to the emperor of the Roman Empire. After the acceptance of Christianity by the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century, Mithraism rapidly declined. So whether these Mithrases are one of the same, or the Cainite Mithras took inspiration from the deity will probably be one of those unsolved mysteries, so you are free to believe what you will. In his mortal life, Mithras was a soldier in the army of some king that predates the first stones of the Roman Empire, situated in the territory where Iran is now located, and served in the military as a general of one of the Indo-Iranic tribes. Even as a youth, he played strategy games with the other youngsters, testing out different weaknesses in both the game and in his opponents. Mithras rarely lost. I'm told that one time he did lose, he lost his temper and nearly beat the other child to death. From then on, nobody would play games with Mithras anymore, which is pretty understandable. He joined the Persian army, rapidly rising through the ranks. Life in the military suited him. He found nothing more satisfying than fighting alongside other soldiers, employing tactics he gained, mastering them as time passed. One day, Mithras was sent out to deal with rebels of the king, hidden in some mountains. This proved to be a challenge, for the rebels also had an equally strong leader. Well, arguably stronger at the time, for he managed to escape amongst the confusion and the fighting with his head, but he returned to Mithras' tent the same night, paralyzing Mithras with his presence. This individual was Vedatha, the alleged creator of the Road of Kings, enticing Mithras with an offer he could not refuse: immortality and power. Naturally, Mithras chose willingly to be embraced by his sire at 1258 BC, who was incredibly impressed with his abilities and leadership. Mithras remained with his mentor and sire for a few years, faking his own demise so he could learn the ways of existence and harnessing his new vampiric powers. Accompanied by some nameless companions, he would return to one of the outlying cities in the kingdom. When he returned to human civilization, he was revered as the living war god of various peoples. As the Lord of Light, Mithras portrayed himself as the bringer of civilization and mortality, who spent his days guiding the sun through heavens and thus only appeared at night. It was not difficult for him to do. Simple people, such as yourself, are incredibly easy to convince, and that is not including his masterful grasp on dominate. It was not long before temples were built, honouring Mithras and his followers, with human sacrifices flying left, right and centre at him as he slowly conquered the kingdom. This was the start of Mithraism as we Cainites would know it, and the beginning of his frightening domination through blood, faith and steel. His kingdom would fall, forcing him to travel west, where he grew fascinated by the Romans, or, to be more pedantic, the armies. The Cainite politics that Camilla tried to establish. Mithras referred to it as stale, and was more interested in what was happening on the front lines, so he would travel far and wide with the Roman soldiers, taking his cultic influence with him, becoming one of the great mystery religions in the Imperium Romanium. He encouraged his soldiers to fight as he did, treating battles like games that were both vast and complex. Few could challenge him, both mortal and vampire alike. It was this mindset that allowed him to take over the chilly isle at the edge of the known world, the British Isles. I remember the year he claimed Londinium, the original name for the country's main capital, 71 AD. Before the arrival of Mithras, his fellow Ventru, the La Sombra, Malkavians, Toreador, and all the other clans that ruined the once pagan soil, the great forests of Britain were mostly lupine land. I was studying the behaviours of the Glasswalkers, who held London as their domain. I was also the closest Cainite to Prince then, but that is a conversation for another time. Through cagey manipulations, Mithras ascended to a position as first among equals among the native Cainites. We fought over such title, but despite being considerably older than him, his strength with a blade was far greater than anything I had encountered before. And before you start getting ideas, that was the last time I lost to anyone in combat. But I digress. The Mithraeum in Londinium became his haven, a meeting place for various scholars. Among them were his clanmate Bindusara, the Assamite and a Diluvian Hakim, and myself. Yes, Mithras was close to Hakim. No, we never met. Mithras would sink into torpor after the Roman Empire fell, taking its soldiers away from the British Isles at about 410 AD. This was roughly when a new cult decided to infect the minds of the mortals and the Cainites thereafter. Christianity. He arose again to the sounds of the invading Normans in 1066. He watched and studied these Normans and their new kingdoms for quite some time, whose priests destroyed his temple and most of his haven. Alongside this, Melserine de Anjou, a Toreador artisan who would encourage and entice a lot of the traditions the Normans brought with them, which did pose a threat to the dominion the ancient Ventru held over Londinium. Mithras would eventually decide to exert his influence, re-establishing his now dead cult, recruiting followers both mortal and kindred alike, using them and his advanced tactical thinking to turn the Cainite rulers, then called lords, against each other until he took over pretty much the entirety of Great Britain, with London as the seat of his power, claiming the title Lord of the Courts of Avalon, just as Henry II became king. The exact date that Mithras claimed Britain as his own was in 1215, at the end of the War of Princes, with the signing of the Rose Treaty, named after the Toreador who started and styled it after the Magna Carta. It was created in response to vampires, Masquerade in particular, using mortals to make merry chaos throughout England's nights, to quote Wilfred of London. It also limited Mithras' power and requirements of his princes. Mithras could not raise an army beyond small personal bodyguards, but the Baronies of Avalon, the various domains within Britain under Mithras' rule, had to come to London's defence. This is why Mithras signed away his power. The Prince of London doesn't need a fucking army when you have every single Cainite at his disposal. All the clans agreed to this signing of the treaty, except the Tremere who were not invited. Mithras openly despised them. I can tell you that Mithras feared how quickly the warlocks rose to power and how they did it, terrified his cultists would do the same. He would never admit this to himself, however, but it is obvious the chill that would run down his spine whenever they were mentioned. And in case you were curious, Masquerade would rule later the fief of Winchester, becoming its prince, which us medieval Cainites refer to as barons, which is not to be confused with the Anarch Baron, although she would insist that you would call her queen, probably despite Mithras. After all, she was the greatest political threat after Mithras. And what is a fief? The 10 British domains under Mithras' rule were broken into fiefs: Carlisle, York, Lincoln, Chester, Gloucester, Norwich, Exeter, Winchester, Canterbury, and of course, London. Each fief had to offer gold and blood slaves to Mithras, which created the illusion of civility when there was anything but during our Dark Ages. These were Mithras' unique takes on the traditions, known as his blood laws, which he believed was more fitting for someone who not only ruled a cult, but succumbed to the First of Ages. The laws stipulated a series of fines and punishments to those who breached them. In most cases, violators would pay a certain amount of fetae to the baron that ruled the fief. The traditions that were enforced most severely were the traditions of destruction and of silence. The punishment? The violators were submitted to the blood hunt. Minor violations of the Masquerade were tolerated. I understand that this must be confusing to you. Princes were barons, and the Prince of London was a monarch of the entire country who treated the 6 traditions like a work of fiction. This would change ever so slightly during the Anarch Revolt. Mithras at first refused to join the Camarilla, claiming that he would never scurry in the shadows, to paraphrase what I was once told. This did not make him Anarch or Sabbat. His ideologies did not serve either of the 3 sects. He was aligned to himself and only himself. In a conference between Lord Camden and representatives of the Venture and Toreador in 1486, he accepted the basic tenets of the sect, Mithras I mean, although he did not join the Camarilla fully. He would, however, streamline his blood laws within his domain to resemble the 6 traditions as formulated by the Camarilla. Because of this distance between the Baronies of Avalon and the Camarilla, Britain was made a workable neutral ground for the Convention of Fawns, which was held in a small town of Fawns. I do not recall seeing Mithras there. There is a lot of history within the UK, most of which Mithras was there for, as he liked to go travelling, leaving the domain in the hands of his many interchangeable seneschals. He also made a habit of banning the Settites and Giovanni not once, but twice. Once during the Great Fires of London in 1666, and again some 200 years when he was briefly locked away in a mortal insane asylum after being tricked by a former lover by the name of Cainites. What is most impressive is arguably his demise. Mithras was driven into torpor during the German Blitz of London during the Second World War. He awoke in 1996, only to be immediately attacked by an entire pack of lupines. He defeated all 5 to 10 of them, the exact number is unknown to me, but that is not important. He was exhausted and horribly wounded. Mithras would not have the time to recover this time, for a fledgling Assamite anti-tribu by the name of Monty stumbled upon him and diabolized the Methulisah. Not properly though, as the soul of Mithras was said to have battled Monty's right up until he was supposedly destroyed by the Second Inquisition in 2012. It is a saddening thought to learn that was how such a powerful kindred succumbed to final death. Don't get me wrong, child. Mithras was a horrible Cainite, a fucking bastard if I were to be blunt for a moment. He was a self-centered monster who had far too much power for his own good. Whilst I still suffer the scars of our original encounter, I do not hold a grudge against him. When you reach as old as I and have seen the country evolve and develop around you, one does have to give Mithras some respect for holding the fort, as it were. It would come to no surprise to you that the Road of Kings was the perfect fit for Mithras' love of conquest. He had no respect for the other roads and was deeply fascinated by the pursuit of power, describing his minions as his little challengers. Some of his closest allies were built out of this interesting relationship. Mithras respected those who could bend the rules of his feudal structure. That said, he was no fool. He knew the difference between amusingly innovative and dangerously rebellious. Of course, the power he wielded as an individual could only stretch so far. It was down to his loyal followers to spread the influence of their god-king. If you embraced some 20 years earlier, you probably would have encountered one of his satraps, who were Mithras' personal force. Each domain or fief would host one satrap. They were mostly members of the high clans, which, as a reminder, were clans Le Sombre, Zemitzi, Bruja, Torador, and Vontru. This said, some of the lower clans snuck in, most notably the Nosferatu. The Tremere and Setites were forbidden. The last time I checked, the closest of his followers were called his heirs, not to his throne or his childhood per se, but those who were most loyal and to their abilities. They would have protected his body when he fell in torpor. When he died, they would have ensured an orderly transition of power and nominated a successor. The heirs had little shared interests and had no rivalry amongst each other. There was nothing but respect for each other. They have little to prove to anyone, other than their devotion to Mithras and ensuring the satraps were prepared to fight for the loyalty of Mithras, meeting irregularly in London or Canterbury. But as I hinted earlier on, this is only one face of Mithras' followers. The other, darker face, is that of his cult, a Mithraic mystery, if you would. No, that's not a proper title for it, but a poor attempt at humour with amazing alliteration. What I want to mention first to you, neonate, is that cults of Mithras are male only, but if you are a mortal only. Some would try and tell you the same applies with vampiric members, and despite the cult of Mithras having mostly male members, some female kindred are found within this cult. As with most cults, this one is made up of secret societies scattered across the world, but mostly in England, notably in Bath and Edinburgh. Unlike most other cults I'm aware of, their members are few, but their members are filled with aristocratic orders, which gave Mithras lots of political power in that the god of Mithraism is real. They worship him and revere his dominion over the sun, feasts, blood, war, and fertility. No, Mithras was not able to walk in the sun, but some of the more enthusiastic of his followers debate whether he was a Cainite possessed by the actual Mithras, or that Mithras, the god, walked to the earth in mortal form before being embraced by a vampire. Regardless, the recognizing of fire as pure is important to Mithraicists. They build, resolve, and bear witness to it often, which would certainly explain why Mithras and his chowder are not so quick to frenzy to fire and sunlight. It is an interesting quirk of the Ventru's blood. The difference in opinion and practice is important to note also. There is never a unified voice in any faith. There is always some discrepancy, which is why every blood offering, sacrificial boar, or enemy will take a slightly different shape in each secret society that follows the Mithraic faith. Mithras is not with them, so the Cainites and mortals alike mutate the original ethics into something more macabre to fit their own take of the cult's beliefs. Murder in the name of Mithras was a great honour for the unconquered, those without a former title. The face painting with blood of the fallen was just as equally righteous. On a related note, diablerie was forbidden, unless Mithras himself permitted it. Members would perform Valordry-esque rituals, binding themselves to each other and to Mithras, using this as a blessing of his to protect them. There is a hierarchy within Mithraic worship, with 7 ranks available to the unconquered, each one bearing different marks. Neophytes are at the bottom and consist of mostly mortals. They receive the suffix Corex on their name and have the Caduceus sigil, a short staff entwined by 2 serpents surmounted by wings, occasionally called the Staff of Hermes, branded on their right forearm with sunlight. It is the only means of branding a Cainite that cannot be fully healed. The Mithraists do not fear this though. they welcome it. Nymphas are the most proper initiate stage for the Cainite Unconquered and must wear a bell or veil for the next month, which is seen as a great celebratory pride. Along with the Paters, which are at the top of the faith, act as a surrogate parent and sire to the Unconquered, bestowing them the permission to embrace as well. Mouses are awarded a pouch of gold and a belt emblazoned with the Mithraic symbol. These demonstrate the cultist is a proven warrior and would wield spears, as Mithras was meant to as he slew the bull. Whether modern members of this rank do this is still unknown to me. I would be surprised if this rank was needed at all, but stranger things have happened, I suppose. Leos wear a laurel wreath like the Caesars of old. They are known for two things: their talents for the arts, often music, and their utilization as being spies and messengers, travelling long distances if need be. Mithras with the titles of Perses lead the bloodletting ceremonies we spoke of earlier, in addition to acting as assassins for the faith. Perses are branded like neophytes, only their brand is a crescent moon on their left breast. They are also gifted a short weapon with their name inscribed onto it, usually a sword, but sickles and daggers aren't uncommon either. The military commanders and agitators have the title of Heliodromus, who rally the faithful, orchestrating violent acts to secure Mithraism's position. On their right breast, a full sun is branded. They also receive a bronze sun mask, a toga, and the fear of all around them, including other Mithraists. As mentioned earlier on, the Pater, a title and suffix awarded by Mithras personally or presumably Lord Roger de Camden these modern nights. Paters are leaders of the Mithras faith, as shown by their ruby rings, elaborate robes encrusted with jewels and metallic threads. They keep the sacrificial blood crucibles used to perform the rituals and the prayers conveyed to Mithras also. I am usually tempted to mock your pathetic, fearful, quivering state whenever I hit you with some hard truths, but not tonight. Mithras is a vampire you should fear. Even his most devout followers fear the wrath of the bull god. Very few had tactician minds like his or the strength in his sword arm. His physical absence has been felt. Make note of my wording, child. Just because he is gone does not mean the lasting impact he has had on our small shit heap of an island will falter anytime soon. Yes, the capital was obliterated by the Second Inquisition, but the work of his followers still carry on. One thing you must understand, child, that London has never been a Camarilla city. The United Kingdom has hardly been a Camarilla domain either. It is a Mithraic one. Mithras will always be the dark centre of London, whether he succumbed to final death or not. Some say he is no more, some suggest he is exploring the Middle East or perhaps succumbed to the beckoning, depending on which cult member you ask. The answer ultimately does not matter. His legacy and influence is just as strong as ever, and I do not see it waning anytime soon. Do you? To be kept updated, follow the Lore by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.